Okay, so last lecture we talked about Song China and how that dynasty ended with the invasion of the Mongols. And again, that's going back a couple lectures, but basically and we looked at the map last week on just how expansive the Mongol Empire was. So China is incorporated into it, and the Mongols really did, utilize what China already had into place. So since we're talking about China, let's focus there. This is the dynasty of the Mongols in China is known as the Yuan dynasty, and its heyday is basically under the rule of Genghis Khan's grandson, Kublai Khan. So this is the first time that foreigners have ever ruled China, and Kublai Khan is a capable ruler. And as I mentioned, this dynasty's strength is basically during his lifetime. It was a time known for religious toleration, especially since belief systems like Islam is starting to make its impact into the Chinese world. Um, and probably the most famous cultural connection during the time of the Yuan dynasty is the Polo family. So these are Italian explorers, and this is talking about Marco Polo, his father, I think his uncle, and they had started to make trade with China. So this is going through that that Pax Mongolica talked about a couple lectures back. And it's a really fascinating story, and even just the way Marco Polo was years later, decades later, is able to write about his adventures. But it's very carrot on the stick for Europeans, Western Europeans. So that's the impact Marco Polo has. There's probably no Christopher Columbus without Marco Polo. So what I mean by that is um, most of the journey for the family to even get to see the Chinese Emperor Kublai Khan was through a trek across land, and it took months to get there. Um, and Marco Polo eventually was left with Kublai Khan, and so he's able to kind of talk about that relationship. At one point, he's escorting a bride to be to another king or emperor, I believe. So I mean, he's very wrapped up in this culture, this dynasty that's there. Um, but he's also writing about all the stuff that's in China, and so that's the carrot on the stick. Once he gets back and talks about his experience, um, then people in Western Europe like, oh my gosh, would love to trade with China, and but nobody, at a certain point, because of, well, you had the Mongols and the wars that went with that, but even people like Timur and others who are going to follow up in a later century, it's kind of a dangerous place. The Ottoman Empire is going to be coming up as well. So I mean, it's not so safe for Western Europeans to be running across the Middle East through Asia into China just to do trade. So that's going to be the carrot on stick to get Europeans thinking about getting on boats and trying to find a quicker passage via the sea to China. Um, so I briefly mentioned places that the Mongols had conquered. China was always kind of being a bully towards Korea and Vietnam, not really to Japan. Aren't able to, and via the Mongols, they're able to conquer Korea, um, but they were not able to take Japan. So Japan is able to um, prevent invasion. Um, the expansion generally, as I mentioned, and just the culture in general, starts to fall apart once Kublai Khan's dead. And the next dynasty is basically known for leading the revolt against the Mongols. So this is led by Hong Wu, and this is accomplished by 1368. Um, and once the Ming dynasty comes to power, and you can see the map here on its size. Once this is done, um, then the Ming, much like other earlier dynasties, it continues to be economically and culturally prosperous. There's big, again, cultural developments that happen under here, under especially under Emperor Yongle. Okay. So, and under him, here's some of the cultural developments. Beijing, this 15-year building project of Beijing occurs. This is the Emperor City that's developed. If you look at the map, it even shows this under the Ming. The Great Wall is further developed, and which makes a lot of sense, right? After the Mongol invasion, there is this step to try to prevent that type of invasion ever happening again. So, which is the development of the wall. And then just culturally, there's this big cultural, intellectual project that's happening, of the Great Compendium, um, that is put there by the emperor. Now, the most famous cultural movement and technological movement in Ming China is Admiral Zheng He's um, treasure ships. Now, these treasure ships are really impressive, and it's hard to describe how awesome they were. As you can see, there's like around 300, a ton of sailors involved, and these are basically maritime missions that the Zheng He went around the Indian Ocean and even to the coast of Africa, eastern coast of Africa, to try to create trade with the neighbors. Now, unfortunately, well, let me first show you why this is impressive. So if you go back here, this picture here is of one of Admiral Zheng He's boats, treasure ships, and this little ship here is one of Christopher Columbus's ships. So you can see just when people are like, "Oh, who had these most impressive culture, at least in the realm of technology, in the early modern era or the 15th century or so." It's definitely the Chinese. I mean, just looking at the scope of the two different types of sailing vessels. So I remember reading these books, as I was becoming a prof in rules and doing Rule Civ 1, on like, trying to challenge my own kind of Eurocentric education where like everything begins and ends in Europe. Um, and the way we are kind of educated, that was like the case. Anyway, I read these books, and they start to like ask that question: who's trying to go where? Are the Chinese trying to get to Europe, or are the Europeans trying to get to China? So that would kind of tell you to answer that question. That would kind of tell you like, okay, yeah, it's the Europeans want to get to China. China has the technology. Now, the Ming Dynasty will eventually kind of close its doors. In fact, they dismantled these ships, which is probably, in retrospect, a big mistake for them, because the Europeans do come calling in the 16th century. You got the Jesuit missions are going to make a big inroad there. And the Jesuits are really good at syncretism. You can look at figures like Matteo Ricci, for example, and they're going to want to do kind of a cultural trade off with the Chinese. And by that time the Europeans pop up, they start having something to contribute because of the impact of the East on the West. You do get the Renaissance, and by the time you get the 16th century, Renaissance is basically on its last leg. But by this time now, Europe is starting to rise as a world cultural contributor, and so that's going to make a big impact. But kind of in closing, because it doesn't look like I'll be able to squeeze in the other stuff. Um, in closing, one of the things I also read recently was just to like pay attention to maps and it was fascinating to look at maps from the Chinese in the 15th and 16th century, so the time period between um, the entrance of more Europeans in the Indian Ocean, post the Portuguese exploration. And what's crazy is you get, if you look at European maps at the same time period, Europe is at the center of the map. And what's fascinating is you look at Chinese map making, China is at the center of the map, and it just kind of is an illusion, or it's a story to kind of say like, we all look at history from our vantage point, and then we look at these historical artifacts, and they illustrate that point to us. So yeah, so that's China. Basically, the Ming Dynasty ends at the tail end of where this class like cuts off. So um, but yeah, very very unique history in China. Um, next, so basically we're starting to wrap things up with the last few lectures. Looks like I will squeeze Korea, Japan, Vietnam, and some of the other cultures in the last lecture.